James, Clare, je vais vous laisser la parole pour 15 minutes. Vous êtes en charge de ces questions de changement climatique au sein du ministère de la Défense au Royaume-Uni. Votre micro est en route. Bonjour.
Only 50 minutes. Could I have my first slide? So climate change as well. Resilience and adaptation is the thing that all our armed forces are used to. It is just that for climate change, it is another threat that we need to be resilient and we need to adapt to. That is the thing that unifies all of us, and we are all on the same journey. So if I could go on a slide. The reassuring thing that I've heard already today is the information that we are actually using is the same information. So this is actually a team sport. We need to collaborate, and we need to collaborate. We need to actually be transparent. We heard about interoperability with our allies and partners. That is going to be a watchword as we actually go forward. And obviously NATO has a key role to play in all of this. And again, if I could just skip on a slide, please, if that's okay. So you've heard this already, but climate change will impact where all defence forces operate. There's already quite a lot of open source information out there in terms of how conflict over resources is already happening in the world. For instance, I think about 3 weeks ago, CNN reported that the Taliban in Iran had a border skirmish around water being released from the Helmand. So we know that these things are actually happening. And we heard again earlier on that there is an awful lot of interest and potentially geopolitical negotiation around water security, for instance, in terms of damming. Again, I think that is going to be a backdrop for the geopolitical outlook going forward. But also, it's going to change how we all operate, in more extreme environments. We heard about the Arctic before. Yes, the Arctic is going to be more accessible, but in being more accessible, there will be more disruptive sea ice. There will be more Arctic storms. So in order to make that an opportunity, we will have to have double-hulled vessels. I can tell you now that probably some of our adversaries already can operate in these extremes. So how do we actually assure our accessibility is going to be a key watchword. What we need to operate as well, new capabilities and resources, critical minerals. All of us are moving towards net zero. Net zero will increase the demand for critical minerals and will actually exacerbate some of those geopolitical threats that we were hearing about before. Our capabilities need critical minerals. So again, how are those interplays going to work out? Who we operate with. We were starting to hear a little bit before about your commitments in terms of electric vehicles. The US, I think, have already announced in the Army's climate strategy that they will field a non-tactical vehicle in 2027, and they will field a tactical vehicle in 2035. Going back to NATO and the importance of standards, how are we going to ensure interoperability and interchangeability against that backdrop? Are there going to be NATO standards around battery sizes, ruggedization? We are at that level of the actual journey. And that, again, is why we all need to work together to actually come up with the standards so that we can maintain interoperability and interchangeability in an increasingly insecure world, driven and amplified by climate change, as we were hearing before. Again, we've also started to talk about some of the actual regulation that's going to come in. There is no exemption from regulation for defence forces. Also, our wider defence enterprise, including industry, are already being constrained by some of the actual changes to international accounting regulations around things like ESG. Again, they also have to adapt to those, and that will actually have an effect on us too. But one of the most important things, I think, and it goes back to defence, all armed forces and defence forces are a reflection of society, is essentially that the world is changing around us. Everybody will move to the 2050 commitment in terms of net zero or faster. And therefore, defence also has to think about how it will actually react to the move to a low-carbon economy. That will give us different macroeconomic risks that we need to consider in terms of how we actually procure our capabilities and actually how we operate them. So as part of our work, it says UK defence dilemmas at the top of that slide. It's not UK defence dilemmas. It's just defence dilemmas. It's the same for everybody. We've got a strategic context that is changing, increased change, increased volatility. We heard it all before. We also know that we need to start to look out forward. I think the US National Intelligence Estimate said that climate change is the long-term shaping influence for all strategy. So how are we going to work in 2030, 2035, 2040, 2050? We procure capabilities now that are going to be operation in 2050 and probably 2060 and beyond. So we need to think through what those interplays are. Stress testing is going to be important. So we know what we know at this moment of time, but how can we think about different climate scenarios and the different interplays that might actually cause? So strategies, stress test them about 1.5 degree world, 1.7, 2, 4, the factors that we heard before. Because by thinking that through, we might actually find new opportunities and indeed new vulnerabilities that we need to be resilient to. Again, we've heard about HADA and MACA, so humanitarian disaster relief, and for us, military aid to civilian authorities. What's our role there, and how do we need to respond to it? And again, just to underscore the point, this is a team effort. You know, we need to extend international collaboration, and that needs to be with the defence enterprise and defence industry as well. Could you go on to the next slide, please? But again, it will also change how the armed forces and indeed the ministries actually operate. It will touch every function, organisational function that we actually have. It will touch what we need in terms of our commercial procurement. It will touch legal, increased environmental legislation. It will touch finance. It will touch infrastructure. Going back to one of the previous speakers, UK Ministry of Defence runs a climate impact assessment for each one of its major sites. It's been a policy position for a number of years, and that's meant to be updated once every 5 years. But is that right? Does that need to be accelerated? How do we get it down to critical assets on that site to understand the actual risks posed by the physical, acute and chronic impacts of climate change? Again, we heard about heat. There's also humidity elements. In the future, we're going to have to think about how we actually recuperate our forces as well. Everything is going to change, and the functions and how we function as an organisation will change too. So it is actually a transformational change. It will change our inputs, it will change our outputs, and it will change how we function as an organisation. Next slide, please. So in the UK MOD, I've got 3 long-term ambitions. First one is to adapt and win in an ever more insecure and unforgiving physical environment. I've got a second ambition, which is to fully contribute to the UK's net zero commitment. And I've got a third one, which is to be a thought leader around the emerging geopolitical risks caused by climate change. Now that's 2050, and that's quite a long way out. So from our CDS, our Vice Chief, our Permanent Secretary, and our Second Permanent Secretary, and indeed all our military chiefs, I've been given a set of new priorities. These are the 5. First one, integrate climate risk and ownership. I think that's probably self-explanatory. We need to embed climate considerations into our policies and processes, and we need to basically think through the risks and opportunities. We need to think through the security implications of climate change, embed them into our force development scenarios. We need to define our departmental contribution to net zero because we are a reflection of society, and indeed some of the softer benefits in terms of recruitment and retention have already been mentioned. We need to develop the appropriate skills and training. There was a question from earlier on. Today we have actually launched our skills and awareness training for all military staff and all civil servants. This is not mandatory training, but we have made that training relevant to those working in defence. And now we need to build on it. We need to build on it to ensure that senior decision makers also have the same awareness of the context in which they're making the decisions. And indeed, we actually have to provide senior board training. So in the UK MOD, our First Sea Lord has already done a climate awareness day for his entire board, and the same has been done with our strategic command. And lastly, we all need to speak the same language around some of this. So we need to build functional enablers and tool sets. We need to have assured data sets. We need everybody to come together in a coherent approach, because that is the way that we can actually embed these considerations in as quickly as humanly possible. Next slide, please. So some of this is a little bit of a no-brainer, if you don't mind me saying, but we have actually rolled out a climate risk assessment methodology across defence, worked with each one of our services, and this is a quantified position. So as you can see there, the major impacts of the known positions to defence at the moment are on our support, future capability, in-service equipment, and our infrastructure. As you have heard this morning, that is everything that has been talked about. I would say that is the known position from factors that we are already aware of. There is a whole host of impacts potentially to our operations, our resources, and our suppliers that are due to that transition to a low-carbon economy. That is the macroeconomic risk that we actually hold, and we need to do a lot more work to actually quantify that. But you can see there for the top 4 that we've broken it out in terms of the potential consequences. disrupts supply routes, reducing reliability of resupply of support materials. Now that can either be in the operational arena, or it could actually be in terms of actually getting the logistics to that area. For instance, I think I saw recently, again, open source, that the Panama Canal had actually restricted the depth of some of the vessels actually crossing through it for about a 2-week period, and I think that's only going to increase. So there's a whole raft of factors that we have always taken for granted that we now need to look at our assumptions and stress test them again to see whether they hold true, again, in 5, 10, 20, 30 years' time. Future capability, I think if we change our policies and processes, we can future-proof our capabilities. But the question is what is the risk that we're currently already holding in our equipment and how we actually operate, and where do we actually need to change? And there's an awful lot more behind all of that. Could I go on for the next slide, please? We're already doing action. We, similar to you, have launched our strategic approach. We did that in 2021, and I've already started to talk about some of the things we're changing. We're doing large-scale solar PV across our land, and that is very similar to you, that the UK MOD has, I think, around 220,000 hectares of land in the UK, which is about 1% of the UK land mass. Some of it is in the most pristine areas or held in the most pristine condition, but we are looking at maximising our land use and maximising the value. You may have seen as well that the Royal Air Force has started to work on sustainable aviation fuel and synthetic fuel, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But we started to prove and test the impacts of sustainable aviation fuel on our aviation fleets. And the key, we're actually really, really looking at self-sustainment on operations. That is where some of those opportunities actually are. And again, we need to think through where those interventions are to actually invest in them, scale it up, and replicate across our force, and indeed potentially replicate across our allies and partners. Can I go on to the next slide, please? I mentioned support. These are the initiatives that are in train at the moment. There are 6 initiatives, and they're led by our Chief of Defence Logistics and Support, Lieutenant General Richard Wardlaw, who is a key ally of mine and a very passionate advocate of all this work. So we're looking at those opportunities and we're looking at that risk. My central team is helping support that work because we're giving the support area the data on decarbonisation pathways, the risk data sources. We're talking about climate scenarios. We are trying to bring those data sources that were talked about earlier into real life to actually do those tabletop exercises and wargaming that was talked about earlier. And above all, we're actually doing this to actually start to embed in that change of behaviours and skills that was being mentioned before. You'll be glad to know that this is the last slide, but again, I'm reinforcing the opportunities. So could go on one slide, please. There are opportunities. There is quite a lot of opportunities around fuel in the deployed space. That is where quite a lot of our logistical tail is. So we have actually done a project which has created synthetic fuel. We have flown a flight, a microlight flight on synthetic fuel, so essentially fuel from air. So we've proven it, and now the next thing is to look about how you can actually deploy that. Now there is a question about whether defence should be a manufacturer of fuel, but if you're in the field, I'm sure that you're aware of the actual logistical benefits of that. We're also looking at doing a wider approach around developing fuel at scale. And again, these are the type of benefits that might come from all of our sites actually creating excess energy. So where are we going to hold that excess energy? Well, do you know what? The actual thinking about estate energy and operational energy is 2 things. I think that is changing bit by bit by bit. Those 2 energy ideas are being overlapped, and that is where the true opportunity comes from. So we are developing a defence operational energy strategy, which is actually building on some of the work that you've done. That's going to be published later on this year publicly, and we're also building a defence estate energy strategy as well. But the key thing that comes out of all of that is energy full stop. The importance of energy to our capabilities. Who owns energy? Who helps to understand how energy needs to be wound into the capability development processes? Because again, thinking that through will make sure that we're resilient to the energy transition that's going to come. So I think quite a lot of this has already chimed with quite a lot of the previous speakers. the main thing that I want to leave you with is the data is the same. We might have different operational focuses and priorities, but the key thing is that we just need to work together to actually have a shared approach, because that's where the value and opportunity can come from, and work again with wider allies and partners to ensure that we can actually maintain the interoperability as we start to navigate through the changing world.